Morning Thursday, March 9th, 2023. Old school versus new school baseball analysis. Here's the question. As far as hitting singles, who had the most singles in a, in a season? Which players had better stats and accomplishments in the old school era versus the new school era? What do I mean? Old school, 1870s, 1949. New School, 1950, 2022. Which group of players in those decades had better stats as far as singles? Let's look at the analysis. I did it, looked up the stats. You take a 10-year period and you average it out. In the 10 years, each year, who led the league in singles? Take the whole decade and average it out. Add up all the decades, get an aggregate number, and see what the total number is. Singles, 1870s. The average, 87. Who had the most? Al Spalding, 105. 1880s, 121 average singles for the 1880s. Who had the most? John Ward, 162. 1890s, the average, 177 singles. Who had the most? Willie Keeler, 206. Whew. 1900s, the average, 159. Who had the most? Jesse Burkett, 181. 1910s, the average, 153. Who had the most? Ty Cobb, 166. 1920s, the average, 175. Who had the most? Lloyd Wainer, 198. 1930s, the average, 163. Who had the most? Paul Wainer, 178. And the 1940s, the average was 145. And who had the most? Red Shinoshis. Don't know how to pronounce that name, but he's a Hall of Famer. 145 or 160. So the old school from the decades 1870s through the 1940s, the aggregate singles total is 148 for that 75-year period. Let's look at the new schoolers. 1950s, who had, what's the average? 162. Who had the most? Richie Ashburn, 181. 1960s, the average, 147 singles. Who had the most? Pete Rose, 158. 1970s, the average, 161. The leader? Pete Rose, 181. 1980s, the average, 157. And the high for singles for that decade was Wade Boggs, 187. 1990s, average singles, 149. Who had the most? Paul Molitor, 167. 2000s, average, 144. And the high, Derek Jeter, 166. 2010s, the average was 114. And the most, Derek Jeter, 169. So what is their aggregate singles total for the 75-year period between 1950?
It's astonishing to behold, but it's part of the picture we're seeing.
Files that the Trump White House had made and
Okay, got something going on the computer. The aggregate singles total from 1950 to 2022, 147. What did I say that the old school had? 148. Guess what? Old school produced more singles than new school baseball players. So what I'm trying to do here in this book is find out who's better, old school baseball players or new school. We can argue and debate it, but if you look at the stats, I'm covering 13 categories of offense. Batting average, most hits, runs scored, runs batted in, home runs, triples, doubles, singles, slugging on base, total bases, base on ball, stolen bases. 13 categories. What's the score so far? Well, I've covered batting average, old school. Most hits, old school. Runs scored, old school, has won 3. Runs batted in, new school. Home runs, new school. Triples, old school. Singles, old school. The score, I said triples, right? Let's do it again. Batting average, old school. Most hits, old school wins. Runs scored, old school. Runs batted in, new school. Home runs, new school won. Triples, old school. Doubles, old school. And now singles, old school. The score is 6-2, old school. Now I've got slugging. Let's see, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more categories. The score is 6-2, old school, as far as winning the categories. And I proved it by looking at the stats. And I just went over singles. I'll recap it. 1870s, 87. 1880, 121. 1880s. 1890s, 177. That was the high. 1900s, 159. 1910s, 153. 1920s, 175. 1930s, 163. And 1940s, 145. As far as the new school, 1950s, 162. No, 1950s, 162. 1960s, 147. 1970s, 161. 1980s, 157. 1990s, 149. 2000s, 144. And 2010s, 114. So the aggregate between 1870s and 1949 was 148, old school. And the aggregate singles total for the new school between 1950 and 2022, 147. Beats them by 1. Old school wins by 1. The score, 6-2, old school. Next video, we'll do slugging. Who do you think wins there? Old school baseball era or new school? Stay tuned. I'm out.